Alright, so I got to start off this video by saying the obligatory rite of passage type of thing where I prove that yes, I am indeed a big fan of the MCU. Blah blah blah, the MCU is a gem of its time. It's a cleverly put together weaving of superhero drama and comedy that very rarely lets itself down in any ways whatsoever. Look, the MCU is brilliant, it's impressive, and I'm a big fan. But as a fan, I've got to say that despite how impressive I think the overall franchise is, in terms of being revolutionary, the first of its kind, and one hell of a balancing act gone right, I will say that I don't think it's perfect. I have issues. Some big, some small, some that I'll quietly mutter right here. Look, I kind of think that Iron Man's death leaned too heavily into a magical artifact in which we don't really quite understand in terms of how it works, and it slightly lessened the impact of his death overall. Look, I do think it was heroic and cool and emotional, but it also doesn't fully justify itself in terms of logic, and looking back on his death out of context without having seen the rest of the movie right beforehand doesn't fully make a ton of sense, and him dying felt unnecessary. Like, did this really have to kill him? Like, why? I feel like someone else could have done the whole snap thing, like Captain Marvel or something, or I just feel like, you know, the writers could have said that he miraculously survived. I don't know, it really just depends on what they wrote down, and it didn't feel like he absolutely had to die. Just the logic of his death was based on a magic thing that I don't understand, so it kind of lessened that impact. What? No, I didn't say anything. Huh? Sorry, you heard something? No. What are we talking about? What are we doing? All right, talking about some of the issues of the MCU that I have. All right, let's get into this. Let's begin. Too much happens off screen. Character development is something of a perk that you get to master when it comes to a 10-plus-year-old franchise. We got to see Tony Stark grow as a person and mature and learn to become a hero throughout these films. We got to witness Steve Rogers reach to a legendary status and to be the best soldier he possibly could be. We even got to learn about some of the side characters and see them grow in the meantime. It's a fully realized world brought to the screen, and you love to see it, but in my opinion, it's not always enough. It's not always brought into context properly, and it sometimes just plops you right in the middle of things, which maybe isn't objectively a bad thing, but for me, I sometimes have a bit of a hard time when it comes to the in-between moments of these films. Too much happens off screen. Now, before I start going through some of the issues I have regarding this, I will say that, yeah, I'm aware that there's always going to be limitations and time restraints, and a film can only do so much, you know? And as well as the fact that shows like WandaVision now are proving that the MCU can develop characters slowly over time and get deeper into them when they have more episodes to play with rather than just one standalone film. That does make a difference. And where the films handled Wanda and Vision's relationship pretty awkwardly by only very suddenly making it a point that they're romantically involved in, I believe, Infinity War, the show was able to give us some insight into how and why they were together a little bit better, which I love and I'm glad about, and I always wanted Wanda to have a bigger role, so WandaVision turned out to be great. But if we're sticking to the films prior to these current Disney Plus shows anyway, even still, too much happens off screen. We see this when in Captain America Civil War, it's hinted that Tony and Pepper have separated, and he seems pretty torn up about it too, but he isn't saying much. And look, realistically, it's probably just a line to explain away the absence of Gwyneth Paltrow, who couldn't make it to filming that day or something. But more than that, it brought even more pain to Tony Stark as a character within the film, who was already amidst a bunch of guilt and other problems and conflict with his superheroic friends. He was under a lot of pressure on him at this point in the series, and Civil War brings out some of Robert Downey Jr.'s most emotional side of acting when it comes to the character too. It's awesome, but it doesn't fully lean into this or explain everything. With the relationship of his between he and Pepper being sort of not that important an aspect to the franchise, it might not seem like that big of a deal. But this has been there since literally the very start of the franchise, since the very beginning. It is literally proof that Tony Stark has a heart. Like, that's a whole thing. But look, so whatever. They decide to cut the relationship. Cool. Like I said, it's not really that big of a deal. I don't think anyone was going to stand up in a rage at Captain America Civil War in 2016 and call it a shit half-a-star film because Pepper Potts wasn't in it. That just wasn't a thing that was happening. But then we get to see Spider-Man Homecoming the following year, and late into that film, guess who gets an appearance but Peppery Patootie herself? She's here, and of course she is. Obviously she is. She's Tony Stark's partner after all. At least that's kind of the attitude that the film seems to have. It seems to pretend that the Civil War breakup didn't happen, and it doesn't give us time to question that. They're just right there all together, one big happy family all of a sudden. Nothing to indicate when or how this happened, and even the idea of a wedding proposal is even right on the table and expected. Pepper isn't even surprised when this is mentioned and Tony mentions a ring. Like, you'd think that if they'd broken up at any point recently that maybe this scene would go differently, but nah, they're all just together and no conversation is really had about any of this. So yeah, whatever, they're back together. Look, again, this isn't that big of a deal, so some characters got back together off screen. So what? We can accept this, I guess. But this isn't the only example of the MCU doing this. Remember when Thor and Jane broke up? But then, whatever. Look, again, no one really cares, but it does feel weird dropping her out and then bringing her back when convenient. Though, to be fair, maybe this had more to do with Natalie Portman not wanting to be in these films, as she was basically just a boring example of a damsel in distress. But now, she's excited to come back as a hero. That makes sense. I can see that. But still, it just feels a bit weird dropping these characters out of nowhere. Some of the character development just happens off screen a little too much, and I just think that sucks. Anyway, another classic example of the MCU dropping you into the middle of things is often at the start of a lot of these movies. Like, for example, I've never really liked the beginning of Infinity War. It drops us in the middle of a spaceship hijack type of situation where Thanos is threatening the Asgardians, Thor, and the Hulk, and it's kind of just swept off like it's nothing soon after. The start of the scene is really jarring in that it robs Thanos of an iconic entrance, if you ask me. He's just kind of there, and to those who are unfamiliar with the series, I feel like this scene probably handled things in kind of a confusing way. If you don't know who Thanos is and then he just shows up, I don't know, it could be kind of confusing. Look, the idea does come across like he's a big evil purple guy. It's not that complicated, but still, it is just a bit funny dropping us right in, where I feel like maybe this scene could have been handled a bit better if it just started a few minutes earlier. You know, it could have shown Thor establishing his situation at the time, and then Thanos can invade and literally everything can happen the same way after. But it just feels like it would be a little bit more impactful if we saw the start of this like hijacked thing instead of just having it be the very start of the scene, if that makes sense. It also would have given us an idea of just how quickly Thanos can fuck shit up, basically. Like, imagine if it did start only a minute earlier or something and everything's fine for that first minute, and then Thanos comes and everything happens the exact same way. How intimidating an intro for that character would that be? But as it stands, we don't really get an idea of how long Thanos has been in Thor's company here. Instead, yeah, it just drops us in, like we've come into the movie 5 minutes in. It's just kind of a bizarre choice in my opinion, and I've never really heard anybody else talk about this. Like, I don't think anybody else has a problem with this. I'm just a bit weird. But the off-screen attack lessens the impact of the scene just a little bit, and it just kind of annoys me. But again, 5 minutes later, it kind of becomes irrelevant anyway. Like, it doesn't really matter. Infinity War just goes on as is, so it's not that big of a deal, and you can catch up with the story pretty easily after that. So it's whatever, but it's just that tiny bit weird. Another off-screen development that the franchise not only makes and not only expects us all to be in on, but actually has the audacity to rely a hell of a lot on, is the entire idea of Bucky Barnes and his endeavors as the involuntarily evil sleeper spy agent guy, the Winter Soldier. At least before the Disney Plus shows anyway. With this, I have an announcement to make as well. Prior to the show, and maybe even still, I don't really like Bucky Barnes, and it's because even still, I feel like I barely know the guy. Firstly, there's his reintroduction into the Winter Soldier when it's first revealed that he, i.e. Bucky Barnes, has actually been the Winter Soldier all along. Shocking, I know. But look, actually, I have kind of a confession to make. It was shocking to me. A little too shocking, even. In 2014, when this was first revealed, I sat there in cinemas like, wait, who? Honestly, like, I get that Bucky is Cap's best friend, but unless you were very familiar with the actor Sebastian Stan's face at the time, it might have been a slightly confusing moment. I feel like maybe I'm not the only one that had this moment. See, look, he's not even really in the first Avenger that much. So I'd say that you could probably be pretty forgiven if you didn't know who that was at first. In retrospect, having watched all the films multiple times and being familiar with the characters, it makes sense to me now. I know who he is and everything. It's not that confusing. But seeing this in cinemas for the first time, only having seen him last time in the first Avenger, 3-4 years prior, like, I didn't remember who that was. I didn't remember that his name was Bucky. So I kind of feel like the Winter Soldier kind of fucked up a little bit on introducing who this character was to new fans who didn't already know about this stuff from the comics. comics. But maybe I'm just an idiot and I was the only one that had this issue. I don't know. That's definitely a possibility. I won't rule that one out. But still, I have more problems with the character beyond that too. Like, for instance, even in his own goddamn film, The Winter Soldier, he's not even that prevalent. At least not to me when I watch it. The film, The Winter Soldier, is about Hydra more than it is about the Winter Soldier. And more importantly, most of all, it's about the idea of security versus freedom. But the point is, I feel like Captain America's entire arc throughout his films was largely revolved around his friend Bucky, and it leaned a little too heavily into this, especially considering that it wasn't even until Civil War where we even met Bucky Barnes properly. And look, okay, I admit that the Disney Plus show is now finally going out of its way to fix issues like this. So maybe this is bad timing to complain about it. But the point still remains for the films prior. I remember feeling like I didn't know the character very well, even going into the climactic films of the Infinity Saga just a couple years ago. Bucky has still been a fairly shallow character in my mind. He's not in them that much, and when he is, he's still fairly sidelined. It's just weird. I've never really understood why people were like a big fan of him or anything. Like, he just didn't feel like he was that big a character. But contradictory to that, the films do kind of talk about him a lot and rely on him a lot and talk about him and all that kind of stuff, even though he doesn't get that much screen time. So it's kind of weird in that way. But this wasn't exactly at fault of the character though. I just think that the films could have done a bit of a better job in handling Bucky and letting us get in on his situation, which again, I am aware they're doing now in the show, The Falcon and Winter Soldier. Another thing that happens off screen, or maybe was supposed to just be forgotten about from audiences, or was ignored or retconned or whatever, was Iron Man 3's ending, in which Tony Stark basically quits. He makes this entire show about it, blowing up all of his remaining suits and throwing his chest arc reactor thingo into the ocean. It's a whole thing. He makes a big deal about it. And whether you assume that he'd be back or not after, you at least assume that it would take some convincing. Like, say for example, kind of like what is like in Civil War, where he only really relies on tech a little bit, but mostly going out of his way to just be Tony Stark rather than being Iron Man, until he's pushed back into it when necessary. That makes sense and that I like, but here, after Iron Man 3, the next time we see him is in Age of Ultron, and whoop, he's cool, he's fine, he's suddenly back in action right again, he's Iron Man, right from the very beginning of the film. And it's not meant to be jarring or unexpected, they don't make a big deal about it at all. It's shot as if it's obvious that he's here and that he's just, you know, in character as Iron Man. And sure, as an audience member, you sit there for a second and you accept, fine, cool, Iron Man's back, whatever. I like him, he's in the Avengers movie, woo, let's get into this. And to be fair, I like Age of Ultron quite a lot. I think it's really underrated, and I know that's kind of a hot take, but I do think that his appearance back as Iron Man at the very start of the film should have felt like a bigger deal, and I think that the film kind of suffers a little bit for that. And my issues in the MCU when it comes to these inconsistencies and dropping plot lines and all this kind of stuff, it's not just about big characters either. It's also about small characters, like in Aunt May's reaction at the end of Spider-Man Homecoming, then becoming a false cliffhanger, rendering it completely useless come the start of Far From Home, when we see that she's now just completely fine with Peter being Spider-Man, and she's even campaigning with him. At the end of Homecoming, she's like, what the fuck? Like, this is such a big problem that he's Spider-Man. But then they just get to the next film and they don't establish this at all. They don't further develop any of this. It's just like, all right, she's cool with it now. Or what about when Thor's best mates from the first couple films are quickly killed off without much of a second thought, not even to Thor himself? Or what about the whole Hulk situation in the last couple films? I feel like we only see him in small doses, and it's lucky when we get to. But between movies, it feels like anything can happen. Like his whole progress turn into the smart guy Professor Hulk in Endgame, it comes completely out of nowhere after his arc in Infinity War, in which he struggles to turn into the Hulk at all. It's just not an arc. One movie says it's this way and he can't do it, and then the next is like, nah, it's cool, he's fine. He can do it better than ever, actually. It's a bit like Rise of Skywalker after The Last Jedi, except that it's the same guys who made both movies in this case, so what the hell? Bruce Banner just fixes his problem off screen and he's like, yeah, nah, look, it was easy, just forget about it. Forget about last time you saw me. I'm smart Professor Hulk guy now. It's just kind of weird. It's like, why didn't we see that progress like ourselves? I get that 5 years passed and stuff, and so it's natural for things to happen, but I don't know. It didn't feel like a struggle. He just suddenly has no problems anymore and is the perfect version of the Hulk. Like, It was just a bit of a weird thing since the last movie made it such a big point that he couldn't turn into the Hulk at all. But maybe that whole plot was just so we could see the Hulkbuster one more time and have a cool scene. I don't know. Anyway, ignoring points made in previous films and not focusing on character development is a major issue that I have with the franchise overall. I mean, not enough to make me have anything but still strong love and slight annoyance for pretty much each and every film, but I would prefer if some of these things were handled just a little bit better. In the end, I think that the MCU would benefit from having some smaller moments, and I honestly think it's finding its footing here through its television shows. A good balance between the two, following the characters concurrently, would honestly once again revolutionize the franchise and bring an even deeper level of interconnectivity to it, and I think there's huge potential there. That being said, I don't want the existence of the shows to be an excuse to only focus on the spectacle in the films. A mix of both, in both, would be ideal. I'd like to see the MCU movies not only bring us back into the films only for exclusively end-of-the-world missions, but I'd like to see some character development there too. You know, I don't just want to see them in the costume. I'd like the films to focus on these superheroes as people as well, which we have seen in some scenes, like in the party scene in Age of Ultron. I just want more stuff like that. See, I feel like sometimes these movies feel like they need to get into a big rush and get to the next big famous comic event right now, right here, right now. But if you ask me, they should take advantage of the medium that they're in a little more often. And I'm hoping that in the future, there grows this sense of unity between the Disney Plus shows and the films, as well as the characters within them. And I do think that they're headed in the right direction. I just want to see a little bit, you know, some smaller moments a little bit more often. I love the MCU, and I know I just complained about it for 20 minutes or however long this video is up to now, but it is amazing. Like, I don't really... Like, it's pretty rare that I often shit on things like the MCU, and that's not what I'm doing here. Like, I don't want this video to come off as super pessimistic and just fuck the MCU, it's the worst thing ever. I just want to, like, I just kind of wanted to talk about something that I love and criticize it a little bit. Maybe because I'm a bit of an asshole, I don't know. But it is a crazy achievement, the MCU. It's awesome. Its filmmaking is brilliant. And it's a crazy balancing act between all these characters, connecting them to this mostly believable world. I think that that's really cool, but sometimes it is just that little bit imperfect. And yeah, I have bitched enough. Thanks for watching/listening, and do the things, which are like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that stuff. Catch me when I'm complaining about something else, maybe.